What was the most disturbing experience of your life? Story 1. I had my tonsils removed when I was a child. At that time, I was living with my dad, but a couple of days later, I really wanted to take a bath. And since my mom had a big tub, I went to stay with her for a few days. The next morning, my throat began bleeding heavily. My stepdad, who worked the second shift, was at home and drove me to the hospital. On the way, I had ruptured a vein and was violently vomiting blood. At the hospital, they had to use a hot iron tool in my throat to stop the bleeding. I lost 4 pints of blood in total and needed 3 transfusions. They said that if I had been at my dad's house alone, I probably would not have made it. It was an absolutely terrifying experience. Story 2. At a barbecue down by the river, my 4-year-old nephew suddenly disappeared. There were about 10 adults around, and none of us saw him leave. We were in the middle of a large grassy reserve, with the river on one side and a wetland bird sanctuary on the other, and panic set in quickly. After about 15 minutes of searching with no success, we called the police for help. It took them half an hour to arrive, and by then we were frantic, especially my sister. She waded through the water, screaming his name over and over. I have never felt so heartbroken in my life. I had just begun to accept the idea that he might have drowned, when suddenly we looked up and saw my husband walking across the grass, holding my nephew's hand. There was a playground nearby that we had all searched at least twice, but somehow he ended up there. To this day, we have no idea how he slipped away or where he was during those 45 minutes. That night, we all drank heavily out of sheer relief. Story 3. Holding my own intestines was the most harrowing moment of my life. I will preface this by saying that I am now 25. As a child, I was a daredevil and loved it. When I was 12 years old, I once jumped a poorly made bike off a large ramp. When I landed, the front fork snapped where it connected to the frame. The tire forced the broken fork upward into my stomach, ripping a 4-inch gash across it. After the impact, I briefly blacked out. When I regained my vision, I pushed myself up off the ground, and when I looked down, I saw part of my intestines hanging outside of my body. I had to cup my hand under the wound to keep them from falling further. The scariest part was that I had been at my mom's friend's neighbor's house without supervision. Clutching my injury, I walked back to where my mom was, and then we rushed as fast as possible to the nearest hospital. Story 4. I was dog sitting for my brother, who has 2 giant dogs. It was a Saturday morning, and my daughter was coloring at the table while I made pancakes. Suddenly, everything felt wrong. I heard a heavy thump behind me, and even though it had been months since her last seizure, I knew instantly what had happened. Even though I tend to panic easily, somehow I managed to get the dogs into their kennels and unplug the pancake griddle before even turning around. It was not her first seizure. I carefully moved her from the hardwood floor onto a rug and started a timer. I knew that short seizures are usually not dangerous, but anything longer than 8 minutes is an emergency. Still, I always worry from the very first second. I called emergency services at minute 4. By minute 5, after shouting for my husband at minute 2, we were already driving 90 miles per hour to our small-town clinic. At minute 6, she began moaning in my arms with a sound that was otherworldly and heart-stopping. It took every ounce of strength I had, and it to collapse under the weight of fear. After a 25-mile drive, she finally came out of it as we rushed into the emergency room. But then, as I thought the worst was over, my 3-year-old daughter tried to talk, and I could not understand a single word. I nodded and smiled so she would not be scared, even though I was terrified. She began wiggling, wanting to walk, so I set her down, and she immediately collapsed. Her little legs had been through a 25-minute seizure. The way she looked at me at that moment is something I will never forget. Somehow, I found the strength to meet her gaze, scoop her up and comfort her, even while terror coursed through me. It felt like living a nightmare. Story 5. I once stared into the eyes of a stranger to whom I was giving cardiopulmonary resuscitation and watched him die. A part of me felt like it went with him, and I still hope I can grow that part back by living a worthy life. It happened in April 1992. He was 63 and I was 25. It still hurts. Thank you to all the kind people and professional medics who responded with support. We can only try to help those around us to the best of our abilities. As a side note, my dear dad had also performed cardiopulmonary resuscitation years earlier on a 9-year-old girl who drowned during a scout outing. She did not survive, but afterward he was able to talk things through with me when my own incident happened. My brother also once witnessed a man collapse from a heart attack while jogging. He rushed over, gave cardiopulmonary resuscitation, and that man lived. So not all stories end in tragedy, and I still encourage anyone who does not know how to perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation to learn. I know without hesitation that I would step in to do it again if ever faced with the same situation. Story 6. My 2-year-old daughter was limping with a fever on a Sunday, so I took her to an urgent care clinic. Within the first hour of being there, she fell unconscious and her fever spiked to 103 degrees Fahrenheit. They gave her some medication and she woke up, but the clinic said she needed to be transported by ambulance to the children's hospital. They refused to send her without an intravenous line. Her heart rate had stayed above 180 to 190 for an hour. They tried 3 times to insert the intravenous line, but each failure caused her heart rate to spike even higher. My 2-year-old was beyond exhausted and upset at that point. She had a fever, she was sick, and she had already been poked repeatedly. The staff went in for a 4th attempt. That was the most terrifying moment of my life. My child was being held down, screaming, while one nurse tried for the intravenous line on her left side, and another nurse monitored her heart rate on the right. The monitor read 238 beats per minute. The nurse watching the monitor said, "Stop, she will die." Those were the worst words a parent could hear. The other nurse replied, "If I do not get the intravenous line in, she will die in transport." Even worse words. I was terrified she was going to die. In the end, it turned out she only had an ear infection and nothing more serious. But it was a terrible experience, and it came with a bill of several $1,000s. Story 7. I am a type 1 diabetic. About 6 months ago, I forgot to check my blood sugar levels before going to bed. 6 hours later, I woke up and immediately knew something was wrong, though I could not pinpoint what. I jumped out of bed and stumbled toward the kitchen, desperately trying to eat something. By the time I reached the kitchen, my blood sugar was so low that my consciousness began to fade. I remember trying to make French fries because the pantry was empty, but in my barely conscious state, I put them in the toaster instead of the oven. My last memory before losing consciousness was being frustrated as I realized fries do not go in the toaster, and I tried to pull them out. Thankfully, it was unplugged. Fortunately, I was still living with my parents, who woke up to find me unconscious and struggling to get ice cream, unable to form a sentence. They managed to raise my blood sugar and sat me on the couch until I regained consciousness. I still vividly remember the feeling of losing control, and it remains one of the most terrifying memories of my life. Story 8. My friend was accidentally substanced when another man handed his friend a drink, and that drink was then passed to him. It was only his second and last drink of the night. Shortly after, I took him home, but during the 10-minute cab ride, he became belligerent, incoherent, and unable to walk or even stand. He drifted in and out of consciousness, crying and begging me to let him sleep. Alarmed, I called emergency services. While I was still on the phone, he began seizing and foaming at the mouth. I had to perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation on him twice. When the ambulance arrived, they had to use a defibrillator to stabilize his heart on the way to the hospital. The emergency room doctor later said he had Rohypnol in his system and that he probably would have died if I had let him sleep it off. The next morning, he told me the last thing he remembered was dancing at the bar and drinking. I almost lost my best friend that night. Story 9. A few months ago, I had one of the most frightening experiences of my life. Early in the morning, I woke to loud noises. Half asleep, I heard the doorbell ring 3 times in rapid succession. I assumed my mom or sister would answer and went back to bed, but moments later, I heard heavy stomping inside the house. When I fully woke, I remembered that my sister and stepdad were at work and my mom was at a dentist appointment. That meant only my grandmother and I were home, and since we were inside, the front door was unlocked. The stomping grew louder, joined by voices, and I realized someone had broken in. Terrified, I locked my bedroom door and tried to stay silent. My hands shook as I put on jeans, several shirts, and my heaviest winter coat. I grabbed a large knife from my dresser and even pulled out a wooden shield I had bought at a Renaissance fair. I knew I had little chance if they had weapons, but I was ready to defend myself if necessary. I pressed against the wall near the door so I would not be immediately visible if it was kicked open. I called my mom and whispered, "Call the police. There are intruders in the house." She sounded confused, saying, "What are you talking about?" I am in the kitchen shaken. I opened my door and went downstairs, only to find her calmly sipping coffee. As it turned out, the roofers had arrived a day early after their other job was canceled. Since my bedroom is on the upper floor, the noise of 10 men working above me had sounded like intruders inside the house. I had never experienced people working on the roof before, so the sounds were terrifying. That morning was the first time I truly believed my life was in danger and prepared myself to fight for it. Storytime. I was about 19 years old when my dad and I got caught in a powerful riptide. I was a strong swimmer and trusted my dad's ability, but there were about 20 of us being pulled out to sea and only 5 lifeguards on duty. Some people stayed calm, but many were panicking. To my left, I noticed a boy, maybe around 9 years old, who was struggling and losing composure. I swam over to him and tried to calm him down, telling him, "Don't worry, this won't last forever. Just save your energy and don't fight it. The lifeguards will get here. Lay on your back and try to float." He was crying, but I slipped my hands under his back and helped him float. I guided us sideways until a lifeguard arrived and took him away. I made it back to shore about 30 seconds later, where I saw him crying as his mom yelled at him, scolding him for swimming out too far. I approached them, planning to reassure him with a high five and tell him he did great staying calm. But before I could, his mom looked me up and down, scolded me with her eyes, grabbed his hand, and walked away without a word. Story 11. During my second year of college, when I was 20, I came home from class to find my roommate unconscious on the floor with an empty prescription pill bottle beside him. He had been deeply depressed due to family issues, but I never imagined it would lead to a suicide attempt. Being 3,000 miles from my family and friends, and with his mom 6,000 miles away, I panicked. His father lived nearby but was the cause of much of his pain, so I felt completely lost. I tried to wake him, and when he stirred slightly, I felt some relief, though he was still unresponsive. I called my dad, who calmed me down and told me to call emergency services immediately. At first, I thought about dragging him to my car to avoid the cost of an ambulance, but my dad insisted I was being irrational. I finally called for help and contacted his mom, though she made the situation even more stressful. At the hospital, they pumped his stomach and he was discharged a few days later. His dad eventually came, and I rode home with him that evening. It was an awful, intense car ride. Sadly, my friend attempted suicide 2 more times, and both times I was the one who found him and called the ambulance. Those months were so overwhelming that I had to leave school and finish closer to home. Thankfully, my friend is now doing very well in every aspect of life, but at that time it was terrifying, and I still don't know how I managed to stay composed. Story 12. When I was 20, I woke up handcuffed to a hospital bed. The night before, I had a bad reaction to medication combined with heavy drinking, which led to a severe panic attack. My friends were frightened and called an ambulance, but my fear of hospitals only made things worse. The police arrived to assist the paramedics, and in the struggle, they handcuffed me to get me into the ambulance. At some point, I apparently turned my head and bit one of the officers on the leg, though I have no memory of it. I woke up confused, without my glasses, and could barely see. Soon after, I was told I was under arrest for aggravated battery and would be transferred to the police station after being cleared by a doctor. Once discharged, they placed ankle cuffs on me, loaded me into a transport van, and booked me into the station. I spent the night there and was transferred to county jail the next morning. Oddly, what frightened me most was not the inmates, but the officers, who began barking at me as soon as I arrived. For the next few days, I was shuffled between cells, unable to call my family, and essentially blind without my glasses. Finally, when I was placed in what was supposed to be my long-term cell, I was told I was being bonded out. The entire ordeal was terrifying and surreal. I later spent a year in court, and the charge was eventually reduced to misdemeanor reckless behavior, with 2 years of probation. It was a strange and difficult chapter of my life, but it taught me a lot about myself. Story 13. My emergency cesarean section was one of the most overwhelming experiences of my life. I felt incredibly sick from the medication and could do nothing but lie there and accept what was happening. I could feel the pressure of being cut open and worked on. Then I felt organs shifting, and suddenly, with a sensation like an explosion, my baby was out of me and wailing. A moment later, he was placed on my chest, looking very upset. The day before, I had gone to the hospital because I was leaking, but the tests were negative, so they sent me home. 24 hours later, my water broke for real. I labored until I was 6 centimeters dilated before getting an epidural. My son's heart rate began dropping with every contraction, and I had small irregular ones stacked on top of the bigger ones. They attempted an amnio infusion to help, but it became clear that the umbilical cord was wrapped. Being cut open was strange, but the worst part was how sick the medication made me feel. When they placed him on me while sewing me up, I just wanted him off because I was so nauseous. In recovery, I felt like I was going to vomit, and the nurse told me to clench my stomach, which was impossible since I was numb all the way up to my armpits. Story 14. Back in 2003, I volunteered for the MS 150 bike tour as a mobile mechanic in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. I rode with a backpack full of tools and spare tubes, helping anyone who had a breakdown or flat tire. It was a perfect fall day, with temperatures in the 70s, so we were all in shorts and jerseys. Near the end, I wanted to ride freely, so I passed my tools to a buddy and continued the last section as just another rider. The hills were steep, and I flew down them, climbing slowly but enjoying every moment. On one descent, there was a sharp left turn at the bottom, made even more dangerous by gravel from a recent washout. A volunteer had been warning riders to slow down, but after the group passed, the volunteer left. Moments later, I came flying down the hill. As I leaned into the turn at about 40 miles per hour, the gravel sent my bike out from under me. I remember my hands hitting the ground, my fingerprints being torn off, my wrist bending in a way it never should, my collarbone snapping, and then sliding 50 feet into a ditch. I woke up face down, tried to roll over, and heard the crunching of my collarbone ends, realizing I needed to stay still. Thankfully, riders I had helped earlier found me and called an ambulance. At the hospital, I learned I had shattered my wrist, which required a T-plate with 6 screws, and suffered nerve damage that left my hand numb until later surgery. My collarbone had nearly punctured a lung. My helmet had been scraped flat in the crash. Without it, I would not have survived. Even today, I sometimes set off airport security alarms and have to show the scar, which always makes people wince. Despite everything, that Trek bike with XT components remained one of my favorites to ride. Story 15. When I was in 3rd grade, my family lived on the 2nd floor of an apartment complex. My sister was 10 years older than me, and we used to roughhouse a lot. She was bigger and stronger, while I was a very scrawny kid, but I loved play fighting with her. One day, during one of our battles, I decided to unleash my ultimate finishing move, the running headbutt. I bent down and charged at her like a bull. She stopped me, grabbed me, and tossed me behind her, completely forgetting that the only thing behind her was the window. I crashed through the glass and nearly fell out, but my sister caught me just in time. I remember hanging from the window with nothing between me and a very painful fall, except for her grip. She managed to pull me back inside, and even though I had broken the window and landed on shards of glass, I somehow didn't have a single scratch. She was so shaken and sorry that she made me popcorn, grabbed me a soda, and we sat down to watch Brother Bear together for the first time. Later, one of my classmates told everyone at school that she had seen me screaming my head off during the whole incident. Story 16. In 2012, my family, my mom, dad, sister, and me, went with my parents' friends, a husband and wife, to a dam and lake for a picnic. There were only 6 of us and just 2 men. It was winter, so by the time we arrived, the area was very quiet, with only 1 or 2 other families nearby. The men started setting up the barbecue while the rest of us played cards. About 30 minutes later, we realized we were completely alone in that section. We thought nothing of it until a man in a security uniform wandered down to where we were. At first, we paid no attention and carried on chatting and eating. Suddenly, the security guard pulled out a large knife and slashed at my dad's friend, cutting his shin down to the bone. Blood poured out, and almost immediately another man appeared, holding what looked like a toy gun. But it was real. The 2 of them quickly went through our belongings, taking jewelry, belts, even pants and shoes from the men. Within 10 minutes, they had stolen almost everything and took off with our car. With no other choice, we began walking to find help. Along the way, we ran into the real security guard, who told us the robbers had tied him up and threatened to kill him if he resisted. Darkness was falling, and it was bitterly cold, but eventually a taxi stopped and took us home. Since the thieves had also stolen our house keys, we had to break the locks to get inside and secured the doors with zip ties for the night. All of us slept together in one room. It remains the scariest experience of my life. Story 17. A few years ago, I was staying at my ex-girlfriend's apartment when terrifying screams and the sound of breaking glass erupted from the floor above us. I ran upstairs and saw a man with a gun breaking down a door. When he noticed me, he pointed the weapon in my direction. I ducked back into the stairwell and sprinted to the apartment to lock the door and call the police. While waiting for them, the screams moved outside. From the balcony on the second floor, I saw a woman running while the man chased her. I ran downstairs to help, but as I rounded the corner, he shot her twice right in front of me before turning the gun on himself. He died instantly, but miraculously she survived. That scene has stayed with me ever since, and I still think about it every week. Story 18. 2 summers ago, my dog, my best friend, was hit by a car. We were out for a walk at night when someone ran a red light. The car narrowly missed me but struck him. I had looked both ways down the one-way street and saw a car a block away. But by the time the light turned in our favor, the vehicle was barreling toward us. The driver didn't stop. In a split second, I yanked my dog off the leash and out of his harness, flinging him more than 25 feet away. I thought I had just watched him die. He tumbled across the street, then got up in shock and tried to run home. He finally collapsed a couple 100 feet from our apartment. When I reached him, I felt blood and urine from the impact, but couldn't tell where the injuries were. By sheer luck, I had pulled his head away at the last moment, or the car would have struck him squarely in the skull. Instead, his hindquarters took the damage. The driver never stopped and was never caught, leaving me with enormous vet bills. But what matters most is that my best friend survived and is still here with me. Story 19. When I was a child, I developed spinal meningitis. It damaged my heart and brain, destroying much of my memory function. I now get by with notes and reminders, but at the time I spent 8 or 9 months in the hospital with countless complications. About half of that was in intensive care, and the other half in a shared room with 4 kids. Next to me was a boy whose brother had accidentally hit him in the neck with a baseball bat, collapsing his trachea. He had been there about a week and developed a cough. The day doctors and nurses were excellent, but the night staff was inattentive. One night, the boy asked for water. A nurse came in, looking annoyed, dropped off a pitcher and cup, and left. When he tried to pour, he spilled everything on his bed. After ringing the bell repeatedly, the same nurse came back, took the bedding and pitcher away, and left him lying on a bare mattress. Another child and I gave him our sheets to keep him warm. His coughing grew worse, rattling and heavy. My memory blurs, but I remember waking to him, gasping and pressing his call button in panic. The rest of us screamed for help as he made horrible gurgling sounds and turned blue. Finally, the nurse rushed in, reeking of cigarettes, screamed, and bolted. Within seconds, the room filled with medical staff. They worked frantically behind the curtain, but eventually wheeled him out slowly. Later, we overheard a supervisor shouting at the nurse, saying she had abandoned her station to smoke without getting a replacement, and that her negligence had let a child die. His trachea had collapsed from the coughing, and we sat there listening to a 7-year-old boy suffocate. It was one of the most haunting experiences of my life. Story 20. It was Easter night when I was 18, and I was lying in bed when my parents came in and started screaming at me like they usually did. I cannot even remember what started it, but at one point they threw a 5-pound tub of protein powder at me, hitting me in the head. It hurt, and I jumped up to put on clothes so I could leave. When I tried to get past, my dad grabbed me and shoved me against the wall with his hand around my throat, choking me. I panicked because I could not breathe, and he still would not let go. It was not the first time I thought I might die at his hands. Eventually, he released me, and I got outside. But my parents followed me to the porch and kept yelling in hushed voices so the neighbors would not hear. They reminded me that if I left, I would have nothing. Just the clothes I was wearing. They had control over my car, phone, debit card, and even the account with my money. They took whatever they believed I owed them, along with my insurance and other things, leaving me no choice. So I went back inside. They always knew how to keep the upper hand, like in an abusive relationship. From the outside, you wonder why someone would go back after being hurt. But when you're trapped in it, the control is psychological in a way that is hard to understand until you live through it. Story 21. When I was about 16, I lived in Palestine and was on my way to school. There are always roadblocks to get through before catching a taxi. Usually there were two routes, one dusty road used by Palestinian students and another road used by Israeli settlers. That day, the soldiers directed us toward the settlers' road. I had my headphones on and was listening to music, so I just walked where they guided us. Suddenly, a white car sped toward us, and the driver pulled out a gun and started shooting. Panic erupted as we all ran. What shocked me most was that the soldiers laughed at us as the car sped away. Thankfully, no one was injured, but I could not stop thinking about how it seemed planned, how they forced us onto that road just to put us in danger for their amusement. It was the most terrifying experience of my life. A few months later, I left for the United States because I was too shaken to return to school. Story 22. When I was 18, I met a girl online, and after weeks of talking, I decided to take the risk and visit her. I was struggling with depression and spent everything I had on a Greyhound ticket to Arizona. She was beautiful, and even now I can still remember burying my face in her dark hair. We were reckless. We fooled around in her car in a church parking lot, then again in a library bathroom, and later back in her car. Eventually, we went to her house, and she told me I could stay. But around 5:50 in the evening, only minutes before her father came home, she revealed he did not know I was there. My nerves skyrocketed. I had not showered since the bus ride, and I felt sweaty and overwhelmed, but I tried to compose myself. When he entered the house, his angry voice thundered. The moment he saw me, he shouted, and before I could speak, the situation exploded. I grabbed my backpack and ran. I kissed her quickly before leaving and barely made it past the driveway when I looked back and saw him holding a shotgun. The sight of that weapon against the desert sunset is an image burned into my memory. I ran to a park and hid in the bushes, texting her for updates. For 2 hours, her father circled the neighborhood with the gun in his car, looking for me. That night, I walked 12 miles until I reached a mall. From there, I caught a bus to the Greyhound station and went home. The fear of that night still haunts me. Story 23. The night I called the police on my abusive parent was one of the hardest moments of my life. At 16, it was the first time I had ever reached out to authorities for help. My heart was racing as she screamed at me, insisting the police would never believe me. She threatened to tell them I used substances, which was untrue, and said she would make my younger sister back her up. I told her she was wrong, that when they saw me, they would believe me. The waiting was unbearable. She smashed things around the house, screamed nonstop, and I just prayed they would arrive quickly. When the police finally came, she rushed outside while I stayed inside, certain they would listen to me. Instead, the captain and another officer came in and told me what a troublesome child I must be and that I was wasting their time. At that moment, my sister shouted that I was on substances, just as my mother had planned. I begged them to test me, but my swollen eyes from crying probably made me look guilty. I tried to show them the marks where she had hit me with a belt buckle, but they did not care. I cannot describe the betrayal I felt from the system that should have protected me. When they left, my mother came to me, smiled, and said, "I told you they would believe me." That wicked smile will stay with me forever. Story 24. When I was 11, I had a best friend whose dad was also best friends with my dad. We were inseparable, always together, and both of our dads coached us in baseball, football, and basketball. It felt like the perfect setup. But then things changed. My friend and I still spent time together, but our parents no longer did. My dad often asked his dad to hang out, but he always had an excuse. Then, just a week after Christmas, his dad took his own life. It was devastating. Everyone was heartbroken. But the most intense moment came when I went to their house the day after it happened. Seeing my friend in that situation is something I will never forget. We tried to be there for him and his mom, even though we were grieving ourselves. Over time, my friend and I drifted apart as our interests changed, but he remains a good person and we still keep in touch. Now, after dealing with my own struggles with mental illness, I am studying to become a therapist and psychiatrist. My goal is to help people like my friend's father and to fight the stigma around mental health. Too many people suffer in silence, ashamed to seek help, and it is heartbreaking to think how many lives could be saved if society viewed therapy differently. Story 25. Earlier this year, at 18 weeks pregnant, I almost lost our baby. My husband and I were about to go see Beauty and the Beast. I had just stepped out of the shower when I suddenly felt a strong gush between my legs. At first I thought it was my water breaking, but it was bright red blood. For a second I froze in confusion, but then I snapped into survival mode. I quickly wiped myself, put on clean clothes, stuffed toilet paper in my underwear, called my husband calmly to tell him I was bleeding, and said I was driving myself to the hospital and he should meet me there immediately. I even stopped to make sure our cat could not get into the bloody mess I had left behind. On the drive, I put my mother-in-law on speaker. She gave me words of encouragement as I started crying, finally realizing I might lose our baby. Thankfully, the emergency room was nearly empty, and I was taken in right away. During the ultrasound, the amount of blood was shocking. It looked like a scene from a horror movie. If I had not heard the baby's heartbeat myself, I would have been convinced he was gone. But he survived. Today he is 4 months old, healthy, and the sweetest little boy. That night, the terror of nearly losing him was unlike anything I had ever felt. Story 26. When I was 8 years old, my 6-year-old sister accidentally shot my 5-year-old brother in the head with a rifle. I was sitting on my dad's lap watching television while he brushed my hair after a shower when we heard a deafening noise from the back of the house. My sister ran into the living room screaming, "Dylan got shot!" My dad dropped me to the floor and bolted for the bedroom. My mom shouted for me to hide the substances while she ran to call emergency services. When I went into the bedroom, I saw my dad holding my brother, crying uncontrollably while blood poured everywhere. The first officers on the scene moved us to a neighbor's house to ask questions, then sent us to my aunt's home for the night. Miraculously, my brother survived, but he was left with partial paralysis on the left side of his body, serious impulse control problems, and other issues tied to his traumatic brain injury. That night, he later described an out-of-body experience, watching the doctors operate on him, seeing Jesus arrive on a motorcycle, as he called it, and being taken up to heaven. He said God asked him if he wanted to stay there or go back home. He chose to return because, in his words, my mom still needed me. We were not a religious family, but his near-death experience has always stayed with me, a reminder that there may be more going on in this world than we understand. Story 27. In July of 2016, I was caught up in the civil war in South Sudan. I am an Australian of South Sudanese descent and had traveled back from Australia. On that day, I encountered rogue soldiers who robbed me and then shot me in the leg at close range with an AK-47. The impact dropped me instantly. They intended to finish me off, but a superior officer intervened. I lay bleeding on the ground for 45 minutes before strangers picked me up in a truck. The road to the hospital was rough and unpaved, and I felt every bump lying on the tray. At the hospital, I received only basic first aid and a tetanus injection. For the next 22 hours, I lay on a dirty table under a tin roof with no pain relief and no water. When I was finally taken into surgery, only local anesthetic was used. I felt every cut of the bone, every stitch, every tug on my tissue. I stayed in that hospital for 8 days before I managed to gather the courage to fly back to Australia on a commercial flight. The doctors there were shocked that I had traveled in such a condition. The damage was severe. I had lost 15 centimeters of bone from my tibia, 13 centimeters of nerve tissue, and 2 of the 3 blood vessels to my foot. On top of that, I had 10 different bacterial infections in my body. The doctors believed amputation was the best outcome, and there was a real risk I might not survive. But after many surgeries, some lasting up to 15 hours, and with heavy doses of pain medication, I survived. Today I am preparing for physiotherapy and working toward a new chapter of my life. Story 28. My brother once asked me to go with him on a substance deal with someone he had never met. We waited at a gas station until a car pulled up, driven by someone who looked like a large high school kid. He motioned for us to follow, so we did, ending up at a dead end a few blocks away. My brother got out to see what was happening, but I immediately felt uneasy. Seconds later, 5 guys jumped out of a nearby car and held us at gunpoint. They separated us so I could not see what was happening to him. I heard one of them shouting that my brother had run and they could not catch him. While they were distracted, I slipped toward the back of our car, which was still running. One of the men saw me and jumped into the driver's seat, trying to steal it, but he did not know how to drive a stick shift. I dove into the passenger side, and when he bailed, I slid into the driver's seat, floored it, and sped away as a couple of them raised their guns but never fired. I caught up with my brother still running down the street, and we got out of there as fast as we could. I still cannot believe how reckless and gullible he had been that night. Story 29. When my 7-week-old daughter died, the funeral home gave us the option of an observed cremation. At first, I thought absolutely not, but then I realized I could not let her leave this world alone. After the longest 9 days of my life, the time came. From the moment I had called emergency services to 9 days later, I had not been able to hold her. The funeral home staff brought her out from refrigeration, wrapped tightly so I could not see her. I begged to hold her, but they strongly advised against it because she had undergone a full autopsy. They did allow one of her tiny arms to rest outside the covering, and I kissed it. Her skin was so cold, but it was perfect. The most unbearable moment came when they slid her body into the cremation chamber, shut the door, and ignited the fire. I felt my knees buckle as my heart stopped. The sound of the flames surrounding her was like being punched in the gut and paralyzed all at once. The scream that came out of me was raw and inhuman. Even now, years later, sitting at my computer sobbing, I realize I have not allowed myself to relive that moment until now. Story 30. I used to work at a local entertainment store, and since I did not drive, my dad would pick me up after shifts. One night as I walked out the door, I hesitated for a second, unsure if I had clocked out, before realizing I had and moving on. I got into my dad's truck, and we headed home on a road with a 40-mile-per-hour speed limit. I was on my phone when I heard my dad mutter, "What the hell?" I barely looked up before he suddenly shouted and slammed the brakes. Out of nowhere, a truck barreled straight toward us, dirt flying behind it. It missed us by what had to be less than a foot, then jumped a curb and slammed into the side of a house. My dad pulled over nearby. The driver stumbled out, limped around, and collapsed. The passenger, a woman, was slumped against the dashboard, not moving. My dad told me to stay in the truck, and for the next 20 minutes, emergency vehicles surrounded us. Sitting there, I realized that if I had not paused that extra second at work, we would have been in the exact spot of the crash. That thought still haunts me to this day. Story 31. One spring break, I planned to visit my cousin in Los Angeles. I was in college in Indiana and chose not to book a flight out of Indianapolis because it cost around $500. I thought it would be cheaper to take a bus to O'Hare and then fly out from there. Since I often traveled to Chicago to visit friends, I usually didn't carry my passport with me. I'm not from the United States, so I followed my usual routine. I took an Uber to Indianapolis to catch the bus, but the bus was delayed, maybe even canceled. I waited for 3 hours, stressed that the next one might not come until morning. Luckily, another bus to Chicago arrived, and though it wasn't my original booking, the driver let me on. 4 hours later, at 10 at night, I reached Chicago and took another Uber to my friend's apartment, where I planned to stay before my flight. The driver, originally from Cameroon, and I chatted about soccer. Then he asked, "If you're an international student, don't you have to carry your documents whenever you travel?" My heart nearly stopped. I had left my passport back home, 5 hours away. I stayed calm outwardly, continuing the conversation, but inside I was panicking. I texted my girlfriend for advice, and when I arrived at my friend's place, I admitted I had forgotten my passport. The only option was to go back. I quickly found a bus leaving in 30 minutes, grabbed another Uber, and managed to catch it at 11. I was terrified of falling asleep and waking up in the wrong city, so I stayed alert the entire ride. By 4 in the morning, I was back in Indianapolis. I took an Uber home, talking with the driver about the NBA, which surprisingly calmed me. When we arrived, I asked if he could take me directly to Indianapolis Airport after I picked up my passport. Since I had already rebooked my flight from there was no way I'd make my O'Hare flight. He agreed as long as he got paid. My new flight was at 7, and it was already 5:30, but I had no luggage to check, so I just had to get through security. I barely made it in time, got on the plane to O'Hare, and finally felt like I had escaped a nightmare. When I landed, my parents texted to ask if I was awake and getting ready for the airport. I hadn't told them about the fiasco, so I lied and said yes. I even calculated how long it would normally take to get to O'Hare from downtown Chicago and texted them again, pretending I had just arrived. Eventually, I made it to Los Angeles. Ironically, I had avoided flying out of Indianapolis because it was too expensive. But after forgetting my passport and scrambling back and forth, the whole ordeal ended up costing me about $700 just to get there. Story 32. I had experimented with many substances before, but nothing ever affected me the way salvia did. One night, I took a large hit of a strong extract while sitting in my living room with a friend and my former girlfriend. At first, nothing seemed to happen, but suddenly I was transported into a fancy restaurant. I could hear glasses clinking, tables shaking, and then an overwhelming dread set in, as if something catastrophic was approaching. Darkness swallowed everything, and I was pulled into a black abyss. It felt as though my entire existence was being processed by a colossal, divine machine, a giant music box consuming the universe. Time and space were crushed through its gears, twisting me into endless shapes before being pressed into a ribbon that became part of an enormous wheel. Something like the Wheel of Fortune. When the wheel spun and landed on my segment, I was thrust into a serene countryside with rolling hills and sparse trees. I ran to a tree and was suddenly absorbed into it, switching places with it. I became the tree, feeling the cool breeze moving across thousands of leaves, seeing in every direction at once, yet unable to move under an immense, crushing pressure. The wheel spun again, sucking me back into the abyss until I was pulled out and slowly began regaining consciousness. I woke gripping the carpet in my living room, dizzy and mumbling nonsense. My friends stared at me wide-eyed as I finally managed to mutter, "Wait, I just smoked salvia, didn't I?" That moment has stuck with me ever since. It changed me in ways I still cannot fully explain, though I know it altered the course of my life. Story 33. When I was 17, I killed a man who broke into my house while my parents were away. I was in my room playing a game when I suddenly heard my younger sister crying. I rushed to her room and found a half-naked intruder holding her down with his hand over her mouth. I froze, then sprinted back to my room. I had a collection of katanas, not sharp but with pointed tips. With no idea how to use one, I grabbed a sword and drove it into his back with all my strength. My sister later told me she saw the blade pierce through his chest. I yanked it out, grabbed him by the neck, and threw him off her. I carried my sister to the bathroom, trying to clean the blood from her as I called emergency services. She was only 6 years old. After leaving her in the tub, I went back. The man was still alive, choking and coughing blood on the floor. His expression haunts me to this day. Emergency responders tested my sister for every possible infection, and thankfully, she was not harmed beyond the trauma. They tested me as well. My sister and I grew even closer after that night. As horrifying as it was, I am grateful I acted when I did, because he never got the chance to hurt her. Story 34. It was hands down the worst Monday of my life. I cannot remember exactly what year of primary school I was in, but it was the first day back after a week-long vacation. After classes, some friends and I went to a nearby playground with a soccer ball. Overexcited, I kicked the ball over a tall steel fence that was at least twice my height. The fence had blunt spikes on top, not sharp but definitely dangerous. Wanting to prove I could take responsibility for my mistake, I climbed over to retrieve the ball. I got across with only a few scratches, but getting back was another story. My foot slipped and I fell straight down, landing on my feet. I thought I was fine, but one of my friends stared at me like he had seen a ghost. I insisted it was just a scratch, but when I looked at my hand, I saw my ring finger completely split open to the bone from base to tip. I screamed in panic. Thankfully, the father of one of the kids from school took me into his home, cleaned the wound, and drove me to the hospital, where they stitched everything back together. Story 35. I occasionally use marijuana to ease back pain, and it never did more than make me sleepy and relaxed. But during a conference in California a few weeks ago, I tried an edible for the first time, and it went horribly wrong. A friend's husband gave me a Rice Krispie treat, and I ate most of it at once. not realizing how potent edibles can be. For about 2 hours I felt fine, but then everything began to spin. I lost my sense of taste, struggled to walk, and even a shower did not help. I felt like I could not feel the ground beneath my feet. My breathing became difficult, and my heart was pounding. One of the leaders of my delegation had to call paramedics. I was lucid enough to answer their questions, but I was shaking uncontrollably and felt as though my memories were slipping away every few minutes. The ambulance ride was brutal. The bumps in the road made everything worse. At the hospital, I was in and out of sleep for 6 hours, had blood tests and a chest x-ray, and was treated with intravenous medication that finally stopped the shaking. Back at the hotel, I slept 10 hours straight. The next day, I was weepy, exhausted, and spent most of the time sleeping. My group leaders excused me from sessions, checked on me, and made sure I ate. Even so, I felt off for several days, and flying back to Boston while groggy was miserable. I was terrified during the whole ordeal, and I have sworn never to touch edibles or marijuana at all again. Story 36. When I was 16, I was with two friends who were 15. We were in rural Alabama and went down the street to buy alcohol from a friend, ending up with a half-full gallon of Crown Royal. We drank heavily, set a fire on the porch, blew up aerosol cans, and tossed random junk into the flames. Fueled by bad decisions, we jumped into my car to drive around. Drunk and reckless, I found what looked like the perfect yard to tear up, so we spun donuts in it for nearly 10 minutes before heading home. The rest of the night went smoothly, and we eventually passed out. The next morning at 9, my friends woke me in a panic. Two police officers were outside inspecting my car and knocking on the door. Terrified, I went out to face them. My stomach dropped when I learned the yard we had torn up belonged to the mayor of the town. I thought I was going to jail. When he asked why we did it, I told him honestly that we just wanted to spin donuts and had no idea it was his yard. To my shock, he laughed, told us not to do it again, and even joked that now he had an excuse to replant his lawn with a different kind of grass. Nearly 2 years later, my friends and I still laugh about it, but since then, whenever we drink, we make sure the car keys are locked safely away. Story 37. Getting lost in Joshua Tree National Park while on LSD was one of the worst experiences of my life. We had wilderness camped overnight, woke up at sunrise, and took 150 milligram tabs before heading to Jumbo Rocks. Instead of returning to the car for more water, we carried only tents and a few supplies. At first we climbed, but as the trip intensified, actual climbing became impossible. So we shifted to bouldering and hiking between outcroppings. Within hours, the colors were overwhelming, the rocks seemed to swirl, and we realized we had wandered about 3 miles into a shallow basin. Every direction out looked the same, too steep to see a road, and the endless boulder clusters all looked identical. Our first attempt to find our way back almost worked. We reached a road just half a mile from the car, but because the road name was different in that section of the park, we thought it was wrong and wandered back into the basin. By then, the temperature had risen from 40 degrees to over 70, and we knew it would only climb higher. We kept hiking, dragging unnecessary tents and jackets, with only the last bit of backwash water left. Our hallucinations made everything worse. We kept mistaking dense Joshua tree groves for people, towns, or cars. At one point, someone even begged a lizard to get help, and we all took it seriously. We eventually reached the right road again, but our car was still a 4-mile drive away, and we had no idea which way to walk. Because of how high we were, we passed up multiple chances to flag down cars. The situation became critical when one of us, who had downed 3 beers before the hike, collapsed and became incoherent. Thankfully, a kind couple picked him and another friend up, and within 10 minutes, they found our car. The last of us kept walking, hitching rides from 3 different drivers until we finally got back. By then, everyone was severely dehydrated. We drank water too quickly, vomited, and decided we had had enough. We booked a hotel in Palm Springs for our final night, determined never to live like animals again. Story 38. My father died of total organ failure from late-stage metastatic cancer. We did not even know he had until the autopsy. It happened on an early morning in January of this year. My mother shook me awake, frantic, saying my dad felt like he was about to pass out. I ran into their room and heard her screaming his name in the bathroom. When I got there, he was sitting on the toilet convulsing. His eyes were wide open, his body straining, hands cramped, neck tendons taut. By the time I reached him, he had stopped breathing, his pulse was faint, and then he went completely limp. I called emergency services and started CPR immediately. I had to pull out his dentures to clear his airway. After 3 minutes, I knew in my heart he was gone, but my mother was crying uncontrollably in Korean, refusing to accept it. For her sake, I kept going for the full 18 minutes until the ambulance arrived. The paramedics confirmed he had already been gone for several minutes, though they still attempted defibrillation, likely just to be thorough. Over the next hours, the sheriff came, then someone from the coroner's office. Finally, 2 men in a utility van arrived to take him. They zipped him into a body bag, placed him on a gurney, and loaded him into the van to be transported for autopsy. I kept my mother from watching that final moment. It was the most devastating morning of my life. Story 39. A few weeks ago, I went through one of the most traumatic experiences of my life. My mom found my brother dead in his basement room, covered in blood. He had just started a new job at the airport working with airplanes, something he was so excited about, finally getting his life together. That morning, my mom went downstairs to wake him up for work. I was upstairs in my room when I heard her scream, "Oh my God," in a way I will never forget. I sprinted down the stairs faster than I ever have and ran into a scene that felt like a horror movie. Blood pooled across the bathroom floor, with trails leading to his bed. Next to his bed was a plastic bin of clothes where he must have collapsed. His lifeless body was there, eyes open, mouth open. I cannot stop replaying that image in my head. I yelled for my sister to call emergency services. She panicked and couldn't handle the call, so she shoved the phone at me. The dispatcher told me to start chest compressions, but my brother was cold and stiff, his feet already blue. It felt pointless, like pressing on a toy that had no squeaker, just air. Still, I could not stop until the medics arrived. When they came, they confirmed he was gone, but I was angry they didn't even attempt to take over. For days afterward, I couldn't accept it. I still don't want to. In the weeks before, he had been complaining about stomach pains. He was 27, had just been dropped from my mom's insurance, and never got checked before coverage ended. I keep wondering if this was negligence on his part, too stubborn to see a doctor. I feel angry at him for that, even while grieving. We still don't know the cause of death. He was my older brother, and we had just begun growing close again. Now I will never get to see him age alongside us. That loss will always stay with me. Story 40. I think I am living through one of the hardest experiences of my life right now. I manage a children's center in Nepal, a safe space we opened after the 2015 earthquake to help low-caste and untouchable children heal and just be kids again. For 2 years, I've worked with a 14-year-old girl who quickly became one of our bright lights. Recently, I learned she was secretly married off. At first, people told me it was child marriage, which we have sadly seen before, though usually between teens, closer in age. But this case is different. This girl is an orphan. She lost both parents in the last 3 years and has been raising her 7-year-old brother on her own, working in the streets to provide for him. Now it's becoming clear she wasn't married at all. She was sold. Human trafficking. I had just returned from being abroad, where I was raising money to keep our program going and preparing to launch an anti-child marriage initiative. My plane landed, and I was immediately told the news. Since then, my team and I have been doing everything possible, taking every step we can think of to bring her back. But the reality is we may never see her again. The thought of what she is going through right now is unbearable. I cannot tell my family or friends back home because I cannot handle their emotions on top of my own. But here, with strangers, I can at least say it. She was only 14. She deserves safety, childhood, and hope. And now she may be gone forever. Story 41. When I was pregnant, I became obsessed with the show I Didn't Know I Was Pregnant and developed a fear that I would end up delivering my baby in the toilet. That fear carried through all of my pregnancies. None of my labors had ever been typical. My longest lasted only 6 hours, and each time the doctor had to break my water. With my third, it even happened while the baby was already halfway out. Every time once my water broke, delivery came within minutes. At 37 weeks exactly, my water broke while I was on the toilet. I wasn't prepared at all. My husband and I rushed to the hospital where the staff dismissed it as early labor. One impatient nurse tugged down my pants, and at that moment, my daughter decided to make her entrance. As she cried, I suddenly felt lightheaded and realized blood was gushing out of me. They quickly whisked the baby away while nurses pressed their body weight into my stomach, started IVs, and injected Pitocin into my thigh. Another IV of blood was hooked up. It wasn't until they began weighing the bedding to calculate how much blood I had lost that I realized how serious the situation was. Terrifyingly, my baby had also swallowed blood and fluid. The NICU nurses worked to clear her airway and stabilize her tiny blue body. I was surrounded by fragile, premature infants who didn't even look like babies, all while being pressured to pick a name. That day I realized just how extraordinary NICU nurses are. They are a special kind of wonderful. Story 42. One of the most terrifying nights of my childhood happened when I was about 11 or 12, staying with my dad for the weekend. We had a great time together, and everything seemed fine. He was upbeat and cheerful, which was unusual because he lived with clinical depression and chronic back pain that required a lot of medication. That night, he went to bed early while I stayed up to finish a movie. Half an hour later, he stumbled back into the living room, glassy-eyed, mumbling nonsense and wobbling all over the place. He insisted on making himself a drink, but instead of just grabbing something simple, he mixed a bizarre cocktail out of every liquid in the fridge. I begged him to go back to bed, promising I'd bring him a drink, but he wouldn't listen. When he finally agreed to head upstairs, I followed closely behind, terrified he'd fall down the 2 flights of stairs and kill himself. I was just a small kid, and if he had fallen on me, I would have been crushed. But I couldn't let him walk alone. After what felt like forever, I got him into bed, only for him to insist on going downstairs again for another drink. We repeated the entire ordeal, and by the time I finally got him settled back in bed, it was late. Exhausted, I crawled into bed fully clothed and cried myself to sleep. I was convinced he was going to die that night. Watching an adult so out of control left me shaken, and it gave me a strong aversion to drunk or high people for years afterward. Even now, seeing someone intoxicated makes me anxious. Story 43. My girlfriend at the time struggled with severe depression and anxiety. One day I came home to find her collapsed on the floor, banging her head repeatedly. At first I thought it was just frustration against the carpet, but as I got closer, I realized she was slamming her face into the hard metal bar at the base of the sofa. I tried to pull her away, but she was stronger than me and kept smashing her head. When I finally managed to drag her back, I looked into her face and realized with horror, she didn't recognize me. We had been together for 4 years, but in that moment her eyes were blank, filled with total incomprehension. My heart stopped. I tried to calm her down, hoping she would shake it off, but instead she acted oddly detached, airy, as though she wasn't quite sure where she was or who I was. I suggested going to the hospital, but she refused, scoffing at me and insisting she was fine, even mocking me for fussing. For 5, 10, 15 agonizing minutes, I sat in mounting panic as she stayed in that eerie state. Finally, I called the stage manager of the play I was supposed to perform in that night, begging him to come drive us. When he arrived, she reluctantly agreed to go, not because she realized something was wrong, but because she didn't want to argue anymore. At the emergency room, she appeared mostly lucid to the staff, so they admitted her for observation but didn't rush her into treatment. With nothing more I could do, I performed in my show that evening, then came home to find her back, headache and all, acting as though nothing major had happened. To this day, she thinks I overreacted, but I will never forget the moment she looked into my eyes, the person I loved most in the world, and asked, "Who are you?" Story 44. Back in 2006, when I was a freshman in high school, I had one of the most frightening nights of my life. I went to bed around 10, only to be jolted awake minutes later by furious banging on our front door and a man screaming, "They're after me! Let me in!" My bedroom was right next to the front door, so I heard every slam and scream up close. Then he began pounding on my window, begging to be let inside. I froze, sitting in bed in shocked silence. Eventually, the banging returned to the front door. Peeking out, I saw a shirtless man, chest and hands smeared with blood. That's when my dad, a former police officer with over 20 years of service, stepped in. He pointed his .45 Beretta through the window and shouted, "Get out of here or I'll kill you!" For a moment, the man froze, seeing the gun pointed directly at him. Then he bolted down the street,